Just on the Right, shall we make a start? So the QR code and the pin for seats is on the screen. We'll put that back up at the break in the middle. The tutorial questions are online. They've been online this week. Tutorials take place next week in week 4. Please do try and have a look at the questions beforehand. So they're a decent-ish guide about the type of stuff that might be on midterms or final exams. There are more questions than we'll probably get a chance to go through in the tutorial. So if you have a look through, see which ones you prefer to focus on, we'll do that. And then sketch solutions will be made available about this time next week at the end of the week when all of the tutorial groups have been. And again, the sketch solutions are sketched, they're not comprehensive, so there should be enough information to give you a guide of what type of thing you need to consider for various types of questions. And then finally, the National Students Survey, NSS, is still live. If you haven't yet done that, please do think about it. Obviously, it's up to you whether you do or not, but it is incredibly useful to help us think about ways in which the module or the whole degree programme can be improved. And again, there'll be a module-specific midterm survey that we'll sort of make available towards week 6ish before Igor takes over. So today we'll continue with topic 2, where we're looking at the determinants of health and the demand for health care. So last week was a recap of some quite basic microeconomic theory, so some sort of fundamental concepts such as demand, elasticity of prices and income, utility theory but under constraints, and how they can and maybe can't be applied to the topic of health because of certain properties that differentiate health from other economic goods. And obviously health is different from some economic goods, but it's similar to some other economic goods. Education health is sometimes thought of being quite similar, but in a general rule, health is seen as suitably different to allow us to modify some standard theories and to use those to try and get an economic idea about what people are doing and how that influences their health and their demand for healthcare, etc. Actually, some quite basic economic theories can be used to explain some interesting trends, phenomena. So we've seen rising rates of obesity, change in mortality rates, life expectancy, etc. And how these can be linked back to some quite simple economic theories about why people do and don't do things. Actually, the key thing we're interested in economics is policy. So what can we do to address some of these problems, for want of a better word, or societal issues that are seen sort of exacerbating health inequalities. Some people's health is getting much worse, while some people's is getting much better. What is it the government at various levels, so international, national, local, hyper-local, what can they do to try and help improve people's health and well-being? And the key sort of new bit from last week was this idea of the Grossman model, so based very much on human capital, microeconomic theory of utility maximisation, but incorporating some, but not all, of the sort of nuances of health. And this is sort of the workhorse model that we tend to use when we try and apply economics to the topic of health. Very basically, people maximise utility, but one element of that utility function is health. But health isn't bought, it's produced. People can buy the inputs that help them produce health, but they can't buy health as such. You have to make it or produce it yourself. And then we've got a budget constraint, so everything has a cost. The things that you use to produce health has the cost, and people have finite budgets. Incredibly simplified, so there's just one input to health, and that was medical care. Obviously we'll relax that today and think about other things, so people's time, people's effort, people's ability, etc., that can go into producing health as well. With the graphical model, we make a number of very restrictive assumptions, but that allows us to do some nice, neat graphs in sort of 2 dimensions and get out some results that are actually incredibly consistent with if you allow a lot of the assumptions to be relaxed. And then we use that very simple graphical model to look at some predictions. We'll look at some of these predictions in a little bit more detail today using the algebra, but the key part of today's lecture is essentially the stuff in part 2. So the stuff that we'll do before the break is more to give you an idea of the economic intuition behind it. But to be honest, it's not the most interesting stuff. The stuff that in the second half about what happens in the real world and how that is or maybe isn't consistent with the predictions is probably the most interesting thing. And in terms of assessment, the stuff in the first half won't be assessed. This isn't a mathematical or an algebraic or a sort of quantitative course per se. There's stuff in the second half about how it bears out in real life and why some papers find evidence to support the models, why some papers find evidence to reject the models, is the more interesting stuff for you to bear in mind when you're thinking about assessment and revision. So as I've said, the graphical representation we did last week was useful, but it's incredibly simplified. So it's based on a number of very, very restrictive assumptions that just don't hold up in the real world. And it misses a lot of the really important nuances and insights that we can bring to this topic of health from an economic point of view. So I'm going to go a little bit under the bonnet, if you like, and explain some of the algebra behind the graphs. So the graphs are nice and simple, but they are based on sort of assumptions, and we'll go through those algebraically today. As I said, it's quite high level, don't read too much. If you don't understand the nuts and bolts, nothing here is going to be specific related to functional forms, etc. It's all going to be incredibly generic, just to give you an idea of what is going on and how that relates to the models. So one of the first problems of the model we had last week was basically incredibly static. So everything was at one point in time. People had an amount of health, and that was just determined at that time point. But we know that health is essentially a random walk. It fluctuates over time. And the best predictor of health today is health yesterday. But health today doesn't exist in isolation. It's essentially a weighted sum of health in all previous periods. So your health today is incredibly influenced by the historical levels of health that people have. And that essentially just says that so health at any time point is a sum of health in all previous time points where they've been discounted by some factor. Obviously, health yesterday is much more important at determining health than health 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. So this beta factor puts more weight on relatively close time periods than it does on health much, much further away. And in the sort of Grossman model in the algebraic form, health, as we said in topic 1, it's really hard to think about what you mean by health, but Grossman thought of it as the weighted number of healthy days a person's had over their life. Just capital H can be the number of healthy days you've had out of all your days that have been in good health. But health is essentially a latent factor. It's unobservable. So they use the idea of health stock to correlate with health. So everyone has some level of health stock. That is used to then influence how you think about your health. And obviously there's a monotonic relationship, so the more health stock you have, the better you think your health is. And this health stock that everyone has but is unobserved is essentially this random walk process here. So our health today is that amount of health stock we had yesterday, HST minus 1. But as we've said, as people get older, every day health depreciates. It's just a natural phenomena of aging, so we have this delta T term. So every period, your health just gets gradually worse. But we can do stuff to improve or to counteract or to even go over and above the deteriorations. We can invest in our health, IT. So this is quite similar to a machine in a factory. So machines get worse over time, but you can put oil on them, you can do things to make sure they maintain their functioning. So you can invest in the upkeep of machinery, you can invest in the upkeep of your health. And in one of the earlier health economics textbooks, this health stock was described as basically a bucket with a hole in the bottom. So the amount of water in the bucket is the amount of water that was in the bucket yesterday minus how much has fell out of the bottom plus how much you've topped it up by adding more water to it. And that's essentially health stock. So it fluctuates over time. And obviously the relationship between delta depreciation and your investment I influences whether your health today is better than yesterday or is worse than yesterday. And everyone wants to have better health, so everyone tries to improve their health by trying to ensure that I is at least as big as delta. But I isn't a thing, it's a production process, so we produce health by investing in it, and then we can define a production function for that investment. This is a very simple representation of a production function, but again you can extend this lots of different ways and the same principles apply. So essentially investment, how much our health improves, is some function of the medical care we have, MT, some function of the time that we spend investing in our health, whether that be doing healthy stuff or whether that be adhering to medication or going to fitness classes, etc., TH. And then we've got this education effect E, which we said last week. Education is assumed to affect the production of health. More educated people are assumed to be better at improving their health given a fixed amount of investment goods, M and T. So essentially what people want to do is maximise their utility, where utility is some function of health, subject to constraints. So we have the same budget constraints, so income is how much you spend on the stuff we can buy on the open market, so in this case medical goods, and then other non-medical goods X. But we've also got this time constraint, so there's 24 hours in a day or 365 days in a year, however you think of capital T. The growth model assumes that you can do one of four things with your time. You can invest in being healthy, TH. You can invest in consuming stuff that isn't health, TC. You can work to generate a labour income, so TW. And then if your health is really bad, you have sickness days, TS. So essentially the growth model assumes that people have a choice of how to spend their time, and each one of those things people are either doing or they're not. One limitation of this setup is that the model assumes that these are mutually exclusive. So time spent investing in health, TH, can't be spent working, for example. But you can think of examples of jobs that are health promoting or health reducing. So actually TW and TH could be related. But in this model we just assume that you have a mutually exclusive choice. You do either one thing or another, you can't do both. So the individual's utility maximisation problem is quite similar to normal utility maximisation problems. You want to maximise utility U, which is some function of health and the consumption, but they have these two constraints. So without the constraints, people would just get as much health as they possibly could. They would continue to invest in their health ad infinitum, but obviously in the real world that isn't possible. You have to make trade-offs between what you do with your time and your money. So get into this idea of opportunity cost again. So essentially this is just a constrained utility maximisation problem. There are two constraints, so we're into sort of Kuhn-Tucker world, where you have more constraints than objective functions, but that's just a sort of algebraic technique where you can solve these types of problems. So we're not too bothered about solving this. This is just a very, very generic high-level representation of the model. But if you do solve that, essentially you get the very standard equilibrium condition that individuals continue to invest in their health up until the point that the marginal benefits equal the marginal cost. So very, very standard stuff. So you've relaxed different assumptions, you've made this more specific to health, but you get the well-known result that MB equals MC. Has anyone got any questions on that? Does that sort of make sense? Yeah? So if you do want to look at specific examples, there are sort of stuff in the Morris book, there are worked examples in there, there's Weifel book, but it doesn't really matter essentially. You can put functional forms on utility, you can put parameterizations on costs and income, but it essentially just get the result that marginal benefit equal marginal cost and equilibrium. But if we just think about marginal benefits equal to marginal cost in the context of health, the marginal benefits are slightly confusing because, as we said, health is both a production good and a consumption good. So the same individual produces health and also consumes health. So you've got a marginal benefit of production and a marginal benefit of consumption. And essentially the consumption benefit, the marginal benefit of consumption, comes from this idea that people enjoy being healthy. So you invest in your health, you get healthy, you enjoy that health. So people enjoy consuming the health that they can produce. The investment benefit tends to be monetarized, so basically people enjoy spending money, and in this Grossman world, the only way you can get money is through labour market income. So people enjoy consuming stuff, they need money to consume stuff, they need to be suitably healthy to have enough money to consume stuff. So you need to invest in your health to allow you to have a labour market income. And essentially we just tend to assume that the people's total income is the wage rate W multiplied by the time spent working TW. So again, very simplistic, no lending, no borrowing, no saving. Income is essentially labour market income. But again, you can relax that and it doesn't make any meaningful difference to the interpretation. So because we have two different elements of benefit, we need to think about both of these together. But an element that is common to both marginal benefits of consumption and marginal benefits of production is this idea of marginal product of health. So the marginal product of health is how much more health you get by investing one more unit in that health investment. And essentially, if you want to think about this, it's the number of extra healthy days you can have by increasing the investments in health by 1 unit to generate 1 more unit of health stock. And essentially, because marginal costs and marginal benefits are easy to conceptualize in monetary terms, we can assign monetary values to both elements of this to allow us to get a common currency. And again, it doesn't really matter if you do this, you can have different units of benefits in cost, but it's just more simple if everything is in the same levels of units to make it easy to compare across. So the consumption benefit, the amount of enjoyment people get out of being healthy, is the marginal product of health, MPH, multiplied by the value of healthy days in consumption. Now the amount of healthy days in consumption is essentially the marginal utility of healthy days. So how much more utility increases if you have 1 more healthy day, but you need to discount that. So essentially, as we've said, this depreciates over time, so we need to make sure that it's undiscounted so that it's in absolute terms. So the marginal consumption benefit, MBTH, is essentially this term here. So it's the marginal product of health, undiscounted, times by the ratio of how much more utility you get from being healthy, divided through the marginal utility of extra income. So this is the ratio, the trade-off, the marginal rate of substitution between health and income. Now the logic here is, remember we said time was mutually exclusive, so time spent investing in health can't be spent working, so you need to trade off between investing in your health and income. So there is some trade-off that we need to account, and that's essentially this term in the bracket is the marginal rate of substitution between income and health. So ideally we want more of both, But because we've got mutually exclusive time constraints, we can't have more of both. We need to make a decision about which one we value the most, and how we trade them off, and that's the marginal rate of substitution. Then the investment benefit, the other side, so how much more income we can get, is essentially the marginal product of health, MPH, multiplied by the wage rate. So however many more healthy days we get, we assume we supply them to a competitive labour market. So every extra day, every extra hour spent working generates the wage rate times by the extra labour supply. Now, so they're the two marginal benefits. The marginal cost of health capital is essentially the marginal cost of investment multiplied by 2/3. So again, because we're making trade-offs in time, we need to account for interest rates, because decisions about income and time and investment and spending today are going to be different, because the value of money, the value of time differs by this interest rate factor R. So essentially that is a nominal rate of interest that could have been earned, linking back to the point we had before. So how much more money could you have earned if you hadn't spent that time investing in improving your health? But then we also need to account for or subtract or less than the change over the same period of the marginal cost of investment, because that depreciates over time. The older you get, the marginal cost of investment becomes higher. It's higher to invest in your health because your health is depreciating at a faster rate. Essentially, this can be interpreted as the capital gains or savings from investing now rather than the future. So essentially, this is very much related to the concept of investment. Obviously, the price of investing at various points of time differs. The same is also true about your health. When you decide to invest in your health is essentially determined by the relative value of the interest rate in different periods, because you can't spend that time investing in health doing other stuff such as generating income. So we're making the same trade-offs. So marginal benefit is essentially the marginal benefit of consumption plus the marginal benefit of production or investment. So we've got that sum, and that equals the marginal cost. So essentially the Grossman model boils down to this well-known standard prediction that the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost, but it's a little bit more complicated because the marginal benefits have two distinct elements, so the marginal benefits of production and investment, and the marginal cost needs to account for the fact that we're trading off health versus consumption, and how we do that is going to affect our utility at various different time periods. And again, it might look slightly more convoluted in a standard marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, but the key intuition is exactly the same. People will always continue to invest in their health up until this equality holds. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah? Good. So it's very, very standard stuff, but it's just been tweaked slightly to account for this production and consumption element of health. So the equation marginal benefit equals marginal cost is useful because it allows us to test this. So this is what the theory says, but in the real world we can observe what people do, how much they invest in their health, how much they consume health, etc. So we can empirically test whether that actually is the case, or whether the model is misspecifying or mispredicting what people do. And importantly, you can use it to test whether different groups of people do different things. So the Grossman model, all economic models essentially assume everyone is homogeneous, but that's not the case. Different people are going to react very differently. So for example, older people who have high depreciation rates of health are going to behave very differently to younger people who typically have higher levels, higher stocks of health and lower levels of depreciation. So we can back that out as well. But because we've got this marginal benefit being broken down into two terms, it's quite hard to observe both of them simultaneously. So essentially we either do one of two things. We assume that the marginal investment benefits are zero and look only at the consumption benefits, or the exact opposite. We assume the marginal consumption benefits are zero and look only at the investment decisions people are making. So the stuff we did last week, looking at the graphs and how you move the quadrants around, essentially is the first one. So we'll look only at the consumption benefits. So just for completeness here, we'll look at the second one, and we'll look only at the investment benefits. So we're going to ignore the consumption benefits and focus only on the investments here. Now to do this, we're going to use an economic concept that is mainly used in production theory. So we're going to focus on the production side of health rather than the consumption side of health, and look at this idea of the marginal efficiency of capital. So here it's the marginal efficiency of producing health, the marginal efficiency of investing in health, and we're going to use this relationship that we had before based on the cost of capital. So it's the interest rate minus the marginal cost of investment plus this depreciation term. So this is going to happen naturally, so we need to account for that anyway. And again, when you look at this by subgroups of the population, the cost of capital, the marginal cost of investments and the depreciation rates are going to vary by age, for example. There's a whole emerging strand of literature that we won't really touch on here, but it's quite interesting. So this also massively varies by income. So people's ability to invest in health is determined by their income. So there's a lot of work in the public health space in many countries looking at this social gradient in health. So people on lower incomes in more deprived areas who are in poverty, for example, have a much higher cost of capital improving their health. It's harder for them to invest in their health because it's relatively much more expensive. And again, the Grossman model, although it wasn't designed for this, can be used to look at this across the income distribution, for example. And again, you do get a very strong and stark social gradient in the cost of capital and the ability that people have to invest in their health. So the marginal efficiency of capital is essentially this blue downward slope and convex shape here, MEC. And essentially it says that as the level of health stock increases, it becomes harder and harder to generate more health. So essentially there's a diminishing marginal returns to investing in health. So if you think about it, health has some theoretical maximum, but again that might differ within individuals. But at least theoretically there is some maximum level of health. The closer you get towards that maximum level of health stock, it becomes increasingly more difficult to invest in it. So as we said, if you think about this in terms of going to the GP or family doctor, the more and more visits you have, the less and less effective those visits become. So they will still improve health, but a very small amount of health. So the first GP visit will improve health quite a lot. The 100th visit will improve health, but in a very small amount. That's the same with your own decision about investing in health. If your health is almost perfect, you can improve it, but only a very small amount. So we've got this convex marginal efficiency of capital curve. So talked a lot about aging, and essentially age is assumed to affect delta, the depreciation of health capital. So the rate of depreciation gets bigger, it increases as people get older. And essentially, if you look at these examples here, so initially a person has this MEC 0 curve, and it's an equilibrium at 0, 0. So initially they have this cost of capital here, but then as they all get older, in the next period it becomes more expensive. So you need to invest more, but the cost of capital also increases. So then basically, because this happens naturally, becomes more expensive, depreciation rates get higher, naturally people's health stock reduces in the next period. So because people know this, they then make an informed choice. Do they want to proactively invest more than they have done historically, with an increased cost to counteract that depreciation? And that essentially depends on where it falls to. So if it's HSA, there is no investment needed. If it's HSB, there is investment needed. So again, very simplified model, and this does bear a lot of reality to the real world. We know people do make these decisions. They might not think about them in this economic terms, but essentially this is what they do. And people are making decisions about whether they want to expend time, money, effort, improving their health, or whether they're happy for this natural depreciation process to basically play its course. Again, you can use it to look at income or wages and social or socioeconomic inequalities. So the change in the wage rate affects both the marginal benefits and the marginal cost. So we've got a little bit of a tricky situation that if you start and alter wages, you basically affect both marginal benefits and marginal costs. So on the benefit side, an increase in the wage rate is going to raise the value of production of healthy days because working time is more valuable. People want to be healthy so they can work more. But remember, we've got this trade-off. So if wages increase, the opportunity cost of investing in health goes up. Because the model assumes that you can't do both together. So if I want to invest more in my health, that means I can't spend more time improving my health. So I've got this trade-off. The opportunity cost has increased. But there are other inputs to health investment function. So this is obviously important, but there are other factors as well. And actually it turns out that proportional change is greater for benefits than costs. So if you increase the wage rate, the returns to health at all levels increase, so people intend to invest more in producing health. And that essentially moves the marginal efficiency of capital curve out from MEC 0 to MEC 1, because everyone wants to have more health because it allows them to generate more income. So we're prepared to trade off some income today to allow them to get better income in the future by investing more in their health today. So before the break, we'll go through some empirical tests of the model. And again, for this course, is probably the most important part of this today's lecture, how these predictions bear out in the real world. So the model makes a number of predictions, so there's lots of inputs to the health production function, and the model allows you to predict what's going to happen to people's health if you change those input parameters. So what we're going to do is focus on education and look at 3 papers in the academic literature that have very mixed results in terms of how well the Gross model does in terms of predictions. So let's just think about, we're interested in the effect of education on health. So this blue line, we've got a key input parameter, education, and we've got a key outcome, health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some econometric issues around estimating this relationship. Hopefully you'll all be able to keep up, but please do say if that's not the case. But essentially we want to estimate the causal effect of education on health. How much will health change if we improve education? So a standard thing might be to do is to run a regression model where you've got health on the left hand side, you've got education on the right hand side, and a series of other control variables. However, we need to really strongly worry about, or bear in mind, or account for this idea of reverse causality or bidirectionality. So education can be hypothesized to improve health, but you can also make a compelling argument that health is a very strong determinant of education. So healthier kids typically do better at school than unhealthy kids. So simply regressing education on health will not get the causal estimate of the returns to education on health because we don't know what comes first. We can't unpick some of the dynamics of this quite complicated relationship. There are also third factors, so wealth, for example. So typically wealthier people have higher levels of education, but education can improve wealth. As I said, there's a very strong social gradient in health, so wealthier people have much, much better levels of health on average than poor people, but health affects wealth. You need to be suitably healthy to create income. So we've got a third variable that can be reverse causal with both the exposure and the outcome. Obviously that's less of an issue because you can simply stick wealth or family wealth or some measure of wealth as a covariate, stick it in the x vector, and that will break that potential causal chain here, and that will allow us to get unbiased estimates of education on health conditional on wealth, but it won't help us get around this potential reverse causality between health and education. Socioeconomic status. So wealth tends to be a very good predictor of socioeconomic status, but not exclusively so. So there are some very wealthy people, families, communities who have quite low socioeconomic status if you measure socioeconomic status in different ways. For example, income. Income and wealth tend to be correlated, but not always. And again, socioeconomic status or socioeconomic position can affect both education, health, and in both directions. They can also affect each other. So as I said, they're very strongly correlated. So socioeconomic status and wealth affect each other. So you've got this whole system of equations with arrows going in all sorts of directions. So simply looking at the effect of education on health is not straightforward. But wealth and socioeconomic status tend to be observable. You can observe people's wealth, or you can ask them to report it. You can observe proxies of socioeconomic status, so income, family position, education is a socioeconomic status, and whether people are in poverty or not, for example, are observable. But we need to worry also about unobservable factors. So ability, so again linking to the education economics literature, ability is unobservable. Ability is strongly related to education, but ability is also going to affect health. So we've got these unobserved factors that can affect both education and health. It's not clear which way around these relationships might operate. Preferences, so preferences over time will affect education. So if you prefer utility today than utility in the future, you might forego education today to get utility through increased consumption today. That's the same about health as well. If you prefer to live in the moment, you are much more concerned about today, you're not going to spend time investing your health to improve health in a year's time, because you'd rather get the utility from spending time doing stuff that you enjoy today. Family background is incredibly important, and genetics, so these two tend to be lumped together. There's a whole raft of epidemiological and more recently econometric evidence using genes to predict education and also predict health. So DNA SNPs can be used to predict all sorts of health outcomes. There are DNA SNPs and genes that are incredibly predictive of education, but typically you don't observe genetics in most data sets. There are examples, so the UK Biobank, for example, does collect information on DNA, and you can use that to break some of these relationships. So you can make an unobserved factor potentially observed. So hopefully I've convinced you that it's not as straightforward as doing a simple regression model where you've got education on the right hand side and health on the left hand side. There's lots of econometric issues that you need to worry about. But people have done lots of clever things to try and break some of these problems, and we'll go through three particular things that people have done in the next few slides. So as I've said, they're all econometric problems, but econometricians, applied economists, are very good at coming up with potential solutions. But you need to bear in mind that in addressing one potential problem, you don't address all potential problems. And if, for example, you're asked about empirical papers on the relationship between education and health in the exam, it's good to be critical. Don't just say study A did this and found this. Say study A did this, that addressed this problem, they found this, but then it is possible that they haven't considered these factors as well. I'll try and give you some examples of what I mean as we go along. So one of the things that we can do if we are worried about omitted variable bias, we can occasionally get proxies for or measures of the things we're worried about. And that's what Marion van der Pol did. So she used some data from the Netherlands that had measures of people's time preference. So as we said, we're worried about time preferences affecting both education and health. If you can account for that, you can break that dashed black line that goes between the preferences in education and health. And that's exactly what she did. There's a really interesting strand of literature that look at twins. So the idea of looking at twins is that their family background and genetics are identical or as good as identical. So if you have information on two twins, one of them has a different level of education, does that map out in terms of differences in health? And if it does, can we say something about the causal effect of education on health, because things you are worried about being unobserved are essentially held constant within a twin pair. And then you can look at policy changes and look at instrumental variable analysis. So lots of countries across the world have done things called ROSLA, raising of the school leaving age. Now the idea of an instrumental variable is that will have a direct effect on the variable you're worried about being endogenous, in our case education, but it shouldn't affect health unless it operates through education. So the idea here is that school leaving ages, if school leaving age increases from 16 to 17, that will impact people's education. It forces them to have one more year of education. There isn't really a direct effect between raising of the school leaving age and health, unless it operates through education. So you can break this red arrow between health and education because you've got a third variable, an instrumental variable, that only affects education, so you can use that to predict how education affects health. So I'll go through these studies in a little bit of detail and we'll have a quick break. So the study Van der Pol did wanted to see whether time preferences affected the relationship between education and health. Remember we said this could be important because how you decide to invest in your health is impacted by your time preferences. If you care about now, you won't invest in your health, you'll just go out and do stuff to maximise utility now. If you care more about the future, you will sacrifice some of utility today to allow you to promote and produce health that you can use in the future. Now, without going into too much details, if you are interested, please do look at the paper. The study by Van der Pol used this idea of stated preferences. So in this survey data set, which was from the Netherlands, as I said, people given a series of questions. So hypothetically, if I give you 50 euros now, or 70 euros in 1 year's time, which would you choose? Now the discounted utility is 0.4, and in that scenario about 60% would rather have 50 euros today than wait a year to get an extra 20 euros. You can vary these parameters, so how much now and how much in the future, to vary the discount rate, and you can get all sorts of really interesting things from this. So for example, if you say to people, I'll give you 100 euros in 1 year's time, or 150 euros in 4 years' time. 80% said they would rather have 100 euros in 1 year's time than wait 4 years to get 150 euros. Now that's not really consistent with economic theory because it's got a low discount rate, but that's how people make these trade-offs. We can use this information to classify people's time preferences based on when and where they make these trade-offs. Now what's really interesting in an academic point of view is if you look at the choice sets below the black line, they're identical to, they've just been multiplied by a scale factor of 10. Standard economic utility theory implies that shouldn't make any difference, but in the real world it makes a huge difference. If you say to people, I'll give you 500 euros now, or 700 euros in 1 year, the discount rate is still the same at 0.4, but less than half of people said they'd rather have the money now. They're prepared to wait that extra year to get 200 more euros. So if standard choice theory was consistent, 50 versus 70 is exactly the same as 500 versus 700. That's just not the case when you look at real data. So this study was good in that it basically could get this. It could really look at drilling down into trying to understand people's time preferences. And as well as time preferences, the question about risk. So it's a bit of a crude measure. People were asked, I am prepared to take the risk to lose money when there's a chance to gain money. And you could say on a 7-point scale whether you agreed or disagreed with that statement. So you can classify people as risk loving, risk neutral, or risk averse based on that question. So that barrage of questions were included in some Dutch household survey data. A decent-ish sample size, just over 2,500 people. Health was measured using 3 questions. So remember in topic 1, we said it's quite hard to measure health. So in this study, people were asked to self-report their health. People were asked to self-report health indicators, if you have a long-term condition or not, your height and weight, and then you can use that to get BMI. And also smoking behaviours, because smoking behaviours should link into time preferences. So smoking behaviours such as smoking are assumed to be bad for health. If you are more future orientated, you should be less likely to smoke today, because you know it's going to depreciate your health in the future. Education was measured using a 9-point scale of completed education based on the Dutch system, so all the way through from zero education to a high degree and above. And the econometric model was very simple. So this is cross-sectional data, there's no time element. So you've got the health status of individual I, HI, is some function of their educational level, conditional on time preferences and risk attitude, and you've got a vector of control such as age, gender, ethnicity, etc. etc. Then, so in the model without controlling for time preferences and risk attitude, there is a strong statistical significant effect of education on health. The more educated people are, the better their health is on average. Now, people have worried that that might mask time preferences, but when Marion stuck these questions in, the information on people's time preferences, the relationship between education and health only slightly reduced. So actually, this worry about not measuring time preferences was shown to be a little bit of a misnomer in this study, because the strength of association was essentially very, very similar. And again, it holds for other health outcomes, but interestingly not smoking. So when you condition on smoking as a risk factor, there is no association between education and health. Now that could be a true phenomena, or Van der Pol argued that it was because smoking status was quite poorly recorded in the survey. So people didn't say yes or no, they just left the question blank. So you couldn't really account for that. There is some evidence in sort of psychology that says if you ask people about how often they do bad stuff, people just ignore the question because they aren't prepared to say that. So again, we're not sure whether this is the real thing or whether it's just because we've got less information on that question. Now, as I said, if you need to be critical about this, and I do strongly encourage you to be critical, this is a cross-section data set. You've got no time dynamics. So essentially you've just got one period of time. It's a relatively small sample, so 2,500 is big enough to do inferential analysis, but you prefer bigger if possible. And you've still got omitted variable bias. Just because we can control for time preferences doesn't mean we completely remove the threat of omitted variable bias. So remember we said genetics and family background were also omitted variables. We've got no information in this study on that question. So just because you can account for one thing doesn't mean you can account for everything. Self-assessed health, as we've said, it's got its fans and it's got its critics. There is measurement error in it, and particularly with cross-sectional data. So it's at one point in time. You don't know what people are using to benchmark the answers to this question. And a final critique, obviously there are many, many more, but a final critique from me is that this is a single financial measure of time preference. There's a lot of evidence to say that people value health much more than they value money. So if you look at people's time preferences for money and assume it's the same as health, that might not strictly be the case. So just because you've got some measures about how people trade off now in the future in terms of money, doesn't mean the same people would do the same thing if it was a health outcome instead. But the take home is time preferences don't really affect the relationship between education and health. Education is good for health. We should invest in education to help people improve their health. A second study looking at twins, Lundberg, Lagkens and Nysted. They use Scandinavian data, registry data on twins, so they have a register of all births within Sweden. Essentially you can identify twin pairs, and because Swedish administrative data is brilliant, you can track people across their whole life course. So essentially you have information on when they were born, who their twin is, what happened to them at school, what happened to them in terms of hospitalisation, health-related activity, death, if appropriate, and other stuff as well. So they employ what's called a twin fixed effects design. So essentially you look at a twin pair, you see if there's any difference in the amount of education within that twin pair, and you then see if that difference in education relates to differences in health. But here we're thinking about health in terms of mortality. So they used identical twins, or MZ twins as they know medically. So I always do this, and I'm not a medic, so this might be horribly wrong, but my understanding based on this paper is that identical twins share DNA, but there's a lot of evidence in epidemiology, maternity literature, that identical twins, although they have identical DNA, face different in utero environments. And how twins behave and how they experience in utero environments can affect really strongly important birth outcomes. So birth weight can be affected by what happens in the womb. Birth weight is incredibly important in determining future health. So babies who are born underweight are much more likely to have adverse health outcomes as they age than people who were born in what's medically termed the normal weight. But this Swedish registry data has information on the birth weight, so we can account for that, we can factor out that constraint. There's this really odd but incredibly strongly statistically significant and evident in almost every single data set. There is a very, very strong correlation between the height of a child or the length of a child and their IQ and education ability. So the taller, the longer the baby, the much more increased probability that they'll have a higher IQ. Obviously that's important because IQ really affects education, it may affect health as well. But because this is brilliant data, they could observe how long the child was and how long the twin was when they were born. So identical twins have the same DNA, but they could have different birth weights, they could have different heights, but this data set can basically isolate that because it collects information on both of those. So they had information on every single twin pair born in Sweden between 1886 and 1958. So 170,000 twins, of which they picked a random sample just to make it computationally easier. So they picked 50,000 of these twins, of which about 18,000 were identical. The other 32,000 were twins, but not identical twins. Now they linked these kids, these twins, to death registries. So in Sweden, as in many other countries, it is recorded when people die, what the cause of death was, and you can link that back to information on the individual and on their twin. The Swedish data is also great because you can link it to administrative records from school, so you know what levels of qualifications, how much schooling each person did, and you've got the birth records on height and weight, so we can sort of cancel out some of those medical things that we might have been worried about weight and height. Then essentially they estimate something called the Cox regression model, which is a survival analysis, so you can predict how long people survive and you can compare survival within a twin pair. And then they found that schooling really did matter to mortality, but it didn't change across cohorts, or it did slightly weaken by age. This is really interesting, right, because people argue that nurture versus nature, and the effect of environment growing up has massively changed. So if you think this cohort went back to 1886 up to the 1950s, essentially they found no difference in the amount of the environment in those different cohorts. So twins born in 1886 were incredibly similar to twins born in the 1950s. And essentially they found that their results suggest that compared to low levels of education, so less than 10 years of school, an extra 3 years at school, so higher levels of schooling, is associated with about 3 years longer life expectancy. So twins who went to school longer live longer than their twin who went to school for fewer years. So twin fixed effect studies are interesting because you can account for genetic factors that we tend to worry about not observing. However, this whole literature has its critique. So you need to try and unpick why twins who essentially are genetically identical, why do they then have different levels of education? What is driving the decision of one twin to have more education than their twin pair. And people argue that, well, that actually might be preferences, it might be ability, it might be something that we can't observe, so we're back into a different omitted variable problem. So we've solved the genetic problem, but twins, just because they're identical and have shared DNA, doesn't mean they think about the world in the same way. And if that unobserved factor on preferences is affecting education, it's very likely that that same unobserved factor will drive differences in mortality as well. So as I said, these results are really interesting, but you do need to bear in mind that we've solved one problem, but we haven't solved everything. And then the final study, before we break quickly, uses school leaving age. So this is a UK study by Clark and Royer. Essentially, they argue that they exploit quasi-experimental variation in when kids could leave school. So in 1947, just after the Second World War, the age at which kids could leave school increased from 14 to 15. And then in 1972 it increased again from 15 to 16. Now, these are quite interesting because this increase in school leaving age from 14 to 15 affected 50% of kids. So before 1947, half of kids left school at 14. Obviously some kids would stay on and they would go to further education, universities, etc. But about 50% of children would leave school at 14. That means this school leaving age increase means they couldn't do that. They had to stay for one more year of education. The second reform in 1972 affected about a quarter of kids. So they would have otherwise left school at 15, but because of the new laws they had to stay until 16. There is an overwhelming amount of literature in the economics field and different fields that these school leaving age policies are really, really good for people's wages. So people who have to stay for 1 year longer that might not have done, wages are much higher than people who could leave a year earlier. They use an econometric technique called regression discontinuity design, so you compare people just before this policy versus people just after. And the logic is people born just before September 1947 should be very, very similar to kids born just after September 1947. The only difference is that one had to stay at school for an extra year. So the sort of macroeconomic conditions, the political economy are very similar, if not identical, but one person had to stay for an extra year than the other person. They get all sorts of health information, so they get death counts, the number of people who are dying, by age and whether it was before or after the policy, information on self-reported health from census. They get information on people's self-reported education, self-reported health and smoking behaviours from the Health Survey for England, and similar from General Household Survey. So Clark and Royer basically threw the kitchen sink at this. They got as much data as they could on people exposed to these reforms on a whole range of different health outcomes, and they compared people who had to stay for 14 years versus people who had to stay for 15 years. So essentially these graphs just show that the policies were effective. So the probability of having less than 9 years of education fell dramatically from about 50-60% to about 10-15%. Obviously it's not zero because people can still leave school. Legally they're not supposed to, but parents can take kids out of the education system, etc. We've got this massive step change in education. Then what a regression discontinuity design does is essentially look at the health of these people here and compare it to the health of these people here. So they should be very, very similar, but you've got this massive discontinuity in their education. And again, we've got the same, so the effects are much smaller because people were more likely to stay anyway, so we had this sort of 25% rather than 50%, but there was a discrete jump in the probability of leaving school with less than 10 years education before 1972. So what Clark and Royer found was a sharp increase in education attainment. Education levels increased dramatically because of these reforms, but it didn't really affect health or health behaviours. So in the data they have, there was no difference in kids who went to school for 14 years versus kids who went to school for 15 years. So this would suggest that education doesn't affect health. There's no difference in people with 14 years of education versus people with 15. Clark and Royer then tried to work out why that might be, given there's a whole range of evidence that said education was good for health before. And one of the arguments they came up with is that these reforms really increased income, and people use that income to do health decreasing activities. So smoking rates massively changed. People argue that people who had higher incomes were more likely to smoke, for example. So that offset in income might lead to no effect on health. Another critique of this, it's a very specific group of people. So people who were leaving school in 1947 obviously went to school during the Second World War in the UK. They had rationing, their nutrition was very different to it is now. So that group of people are not generalisable to what might happen now. It's a very localised effect. So if you're familiar with the instrumental variable literature, this is something called the local average treatment effect. It's incredibly localised to the group of people affected. We can't generalise to later cohorts. Is that okay about the study? So there's sort of mixed evidence. As a rule of thumb, people are supportive of the idea that education affects health, but it's not ubiquitous. There are examples of relationship not being true. So we'll stop for 5 minutes. It's 4 o'clock. If you come back just after 5 past, we'll finish the rest of the topic and finish a little bit early today.
Without leaving all of that. Let me know. Because if it's 12, we're actually screwed. But I feel like I remember she said something like, it has to be a certain font.
Right, it's about 10 past, so we'll make a start and then we'll probably finish a little bit early. But that stuff that we've just gone through, if it was me revising for the exam, I would revise that type of stuff, but that's a little bit of a hidden, but don't look too much into it. So, we'll now look at some criticisms of the model. As I've said, the Grossman model tries to address some criticisms of standard utility maximisation theory, but it is far, far from perfect. And Mike Grossman himself talks very frankly about this. His model was never meant to be used as the workhorse, but it has sort of ended up as that type of model. But he is very upfront and frank about these. He writes papers himself criticising his own model because he thinks that it doesn't address some of the problems in as much detail as it really needs to. So it still assumes that people are consistent utility maximising agents, and as we've said, there is overwhelming evidence that that's just not the case. So people do things that are completely inconsistent with maximising. Even if that's as minor as crossing the road without the green light, that is not consistent with the Grossman model, because people shouldn't do that, because there is a non-zero probability that could lead to an adverse health event. It assumes perfect information, so it assumes that people have perfect information and perfect foresight about their health. It assumes that rates of depreciation delta, that delta term, is known to people. It assumes that we as individuals know, appreciate and can comprehend information related to health care and how that's going to improve our health. Obviously that's not the case. We don't fully understand medical diagnosis, we don't fully understand medical treatments. We rely on qualified health and care professionals to give us advice and guidance. And as we'll come on to in the rest of today, that can lead to this phenomenon of supplier-induced demand. Now if you think about the extreme interpretation of the Grossman model, it assumes that we know the depreciation rate of our health, and it assumes that we know how much health changes as we invest in it. So basically we know both how much it goes down and how much it can maximally go up. So in the extreme, that means we all know when we're going to die. We're going to know when health turns into zero, and that is the point of death essentially. So it assumes that we know then when we're going to die, and we then make rational, informed decisions about that day. We can bring it forward, we can try to push it back as far as possible, but it assumes that we know with certainty the date of our own death, which is quite depressing when you think about it. It doesn't take into account uncertainty. So adverse health events, so accidents, flu, COVID, pandemics, are basically unpredictable. We can't do anything about that. And essentially the Grossman model assumes that because we know everything about our health, these things don't happen. There is nothing uncertain. And again, going back to this asymmetry of information, where we don't really know our health, we rely on people who are medically qualified to tell us about our health, and particularly tell us about how we need to consume medical goods, services, drugs, treatments, operations to help us improve or promote or to enhance our health. Now this is a perfect example of an asymmetric information problem, which is exactly what is characterised by supplier-induced demand. So this comes out of this seminal paper by Arrow, which we chatted about in topic 1, about uncertainty being a major determinant factor in the health and care system. Obviously, uncertainty is ubiquitous, it is ever present in almost every aspect of our lives, but it is much more prominent, much more present when we think about health and healthcare. And as I've said, this uncertainty manifests in the diagnosis of conditions, it manifests in the availability of treatments and their effectiveness of those treatments. Obviously some uncertainty is just irreducible, there is nothing we can do about it. So again, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, before the vaccination programme, there was nothing we could really do about reducing that uncertainty of whether, if you contracted COVID, you'd have an adverse health outcome or not. But much of the uncertainty, almost all of the uncertainty, is one-sided. We as individuals, we as consumers of health care, lack the medical training and knowledge to enable us to make these truly informed choices. So as we said before, if you want to buy a car, you know roughly what you want. If you present at a hospital, you don't really know what operation you need, so you rely on the medic to tell you that. This is essentially a principal agent problem. So the doctor is the economic agent, and they are acting on the behalf of the principal, which is the patient, which is us, the people without the medical background. Obviously, this isn't unique to healthcare. So you might have seen supplier-induced demand when you're thinking about sort of car mechanics. You take your car to a car mechanic, you don't really know what's wrong with it, you rely on the mechanic to diagnose what's wrong with your car, and that mechanic will then fix the car. So they've got a dual incentive. They need to tell you what's wrong with your car, how to improve it, but they then get revenue income from you because you pay them to do what they've told you you need. That's the same in health. As I said, it's less of an issue at the individual level in the UK in taxation funded systems because we don't pay for healthcare when we use it, but the government still pays. This is still a problem. Just because taxation pays for health doesn't mean medics should be free to induce as much demand as they can. Somebody somewhere, us as taxpayers, still pay for the amount of healthcare within society. Obviously in the US it's different with the insurance. We as consumers would pay for health through insurance, or discounted through Medicaid, for example. And there is some evidence to say that the level or the organisation of healthcare does affect whether or not supplier-induced demand is thought to be an issue. But essentially it's often assumed that doctors, medical professionals don't behave as perfect agents. So a perfect agent would recommend the advice to you that they themselves would have. So basically they should act exactly in your interests. But there's some evidence to suggest that doesn't happen. Medics want to promote their own utility, their own income, so they can recommend treatments that you don't really need. That's called supplier-induced demand. In the US it's called physician-induced demand because it's specific to the physician industry, but obviously it's the same thing. And Maguire defined this as medics engage in some persuasive activity to shift the patient's demand curve according to the physician's self-interest. So they artificially move in demand in or out to lead to benefits for them as a physician. So if we just think of supplier-induced demand graphically, we have simple demand and supply diagram, downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. And then, so supply-induced demand posits that if there's an exogenous increase in supply from S1 to S2, what happens to demand? So in basic economic theory, a shift in supply should not affect demand. They should be completely independent of each other. So the argument goes that you have this demand and supply curve. You've got this exogenous increase in supply from S1 to S2. So essentially we should get a lowering of price and an increase in quantity demand. Now the key question is, if we've got this exogenous shift in supply, but then we also observe an increase in demand, what is driving that? There is no reason that should happen, so the logical explanation is these extra physicians, this extra increase in supply, are artificially inflating people's demand. They're moving the demand curve out to map onto their own self-interests. But empirically, as we said, it's incredibly difficult to estimate demand curves. So some people argue that just because price has gone down and quantity has gone up, that doesn't automatically assume there is supply-induced demand. If you look at the equilibrium without an increase, an induced increase in demand, they have the same properties. Price goes down and quantity goes up. The amount to which quantity and price changes is different, but essentially they move in the same direction. So could we not just simply be at the real level rather than induced level? Another argument is that's incredibly difficult to construct demand curves, and we could have simply just misspecified the original demand curve. If we assume it's D1, but it's actually D star, the increase in demand the increase in quantity and reduction in price is exactly consistent with what we observe, and there's no inducement at all. We've just simply misspecified the demand curve. And then some people argue that actually if supply increases, demand might move through other non-induced reasons anyway. So for example, the population might have got bigger, the population might have got sicker, the population might have got older, so the demand curve would move out anyway. The physician, the supplier, the medical professional has done nothing to induce that demand. It's just a natural change in demand that happened anyway. So essentially it's incredibly difficult to prove or disprove the existence of supply-induced demand with simple demand and supply curve, because we don't really know the shape of the demand and supply curve. We can assume it, but we could be horribly wrong. So this idea of supply-induced demand is incredibly controversial, as you can imagine. So if you assume it is a real thing and physicians, suppliers, medical professionals are acting in their own best interest, that is questioning their underlying motivation for being a physician. So we'll touch back on this again in topic 3 when we look at the motivations for medics and how they differ from profit maximisation. But if you say supply-induced demand is a real thing, you are questioning the integrity and the medical professionalism of people working in this industry. Again, it could be income maximisation rather than utility maximisation physicians are interested in, but there's a strong belief that the patient's welfare, the patient's health, is a really strong element of a physician's demand, utility curve. But this then contradicts that. The existence of supply-induced demand you can't really do with demand and supply diagrams because it's impossible to construct accurate demand and supply diagrams. So essentially people have done lots of interesting studies to try and look at the real world to see what happens when you've got changes in the supply. Or is supply-induced demand the real thing? So one study that seemed to find quite compelling evidence that supply-induced demand was a real thing was what they called a field experiment in Switzerland, where the researchers got a patient with perfect teeth. The person did not need any dental treatment at all. The researchers then sent this patient to 180 different dentists and asked them to recommend treatment for the patient. In 28% of visits, the dentist recommended treatment that wasn't needed. There was no medical reason for the treatment prescribed to be given, but yet 28% of dentists did recommend treatment that had no medical benefit at all. So what's really worrying, I think, from when I look at this paper, is that this 28% was the average, but this varied a lot. So it varied a lot by socioeconomic position. So when this patient, who was the exact same patient, but the research team asked them to pretend to be different people. So they would go into one dentist and say that they had no education. They'd go into a different dentist and say they had a degree level education. If the patient said they had low levels of education, the dentist was much, much more likely to say they needed stuff they didn't. And the researchers argue that's because, again, education is a proxy for ability. People with low levels of education were assumed to not be able to recognise the fact they're being exploited. Now this is ethically wrong for lots of reasons, but it's also wrong because people with lower levels of education, lower levels of income, are much less likely to be able to afford this treatment they're being recommended that they don't actually need. They looked at the characteristics of the dentist. So in Switzerland you could get information on how many patients were registered with the dentists, and dentists with lower patient list sizes and smaller waiting times were more likely to recommend treatment that wasn't needed. And again, that's consistent with supply-induced demand. You are a dentist, you haven't got as much demand as you need, you see a patient come in, you tell them they need something that they don't actually need. So this is all completely consistent with supply-induced demand. However, when they looked at the availability of alternative dentists, so how concentrated the market was for dentists, so you could compare people who had lots of competition with people who had very little competition, there was no difference by the contestability of the market. So that sort of counteracts the supply-induced demand theory, because you'd expect people with more competition to be more likely to induce demand. But that didn't happen. But overwhelmingly, this paper seemed to suggest supply-induced demand for dentistry in Switzerland was a real thing. However, a paper who looked at GPs or family doctors in Norway basically refuted the idea of supplier-induced demand. Now, Norway is an interesting country to look at supplier-induced demand for GPs because there are two types of GPs. So they have one type of doctor who's called a contract physician and one called a salaried physician. Now, contract physicians are basically paid for what they do. If they treat 100 patients, they're paid for treating those 100 patients. A salaried physician is given a salary. They get the same amount of money whether they treat 1 patient or 1,000 patients. So this basically, you've got competing incentives. So a contract physician has an incentive to induce demand. If they don't treat anyone, they don't get paid. Salaried physicians have no incentive at all. In fact, they've probably got an incentive not to treat patients because the less they do, they're still getting the same money. They haven't got any incentive to tell people who need stuff that they definitely don't need. So, and this decision about whether you end up a contract physician or a salaried physician was basically randomly allocated to a group of newly qualified GPs. Then the research team basically found that neither salaried physicians or contract physicians changed their output, changed the number of medical procedures they performed when the physician density changed. So if you were the only GP in a big area, you behaved exactly the same no matter whether you were a contract physician or a salaried physician, whether you had lots of competition. So basically they said that because both groups of physicians behaved the same, there was no evidence of supplier-induced demand because we would expect stark differences between groups 1 and 2. But obviously both of these examples are very context specific. So dentists in Switzerland are going to be very different to GPs in Norway. So just because they exist in one market doesn't provide universal proof it exists everywhere. And just because it doesn't exist in one setting doesn't mean we can refute the idea in every single context. So again, we've got very localized effect sizes. We need to be very careful that we don't make generalizations based on a very unique group of people. And there are other issues around supplier-induced demand as well. So obviously we've said it's very hard to estimate demand curves, but even if we could, to look at supplier-induced demand in its truest form, you need an exogenous shift in supply. So you need this increase in supply to be sudden and unpredicted. Because if you can see your competitor changing their behaviour in advance, you could change your behaviour in advance. So you need it to be completely unobserved or exogenous. Obviously that's not going to be the case. You can't just transplant a GP from one place to another. You have to build the facilities, you have to have the infrastructure. People can see that happen. You need to register to practice medicine. You can't just turn up and start being a medic. So you can't really have an exogenous shift in supply. An empirical problem is that obviously we rely on data to examine this, and we never really observe everything forever. We have a start date when we start to collect data. If people are already inducing demand when we first observed them, they wouldn't change that. They've already induced as much demand as they can. But we would see no change in the behaviour and assume there was no inducement. But if the inducement was already happening but it didn't induce more, that would essentially come out as a null effect, even though it was consistent with supplier-induced demand. And then a more sort of philosophical question is that economics basically is based on this concept of markets and people trading goods and services. You've got a supplier and a consumer. If one person can influence both sides of that demand-supply relationship, how is an equilibrium ever reached? There is no trade, there is no bartering, there's no arguments. It's the same person, so they can't really exist. And again, linking back to motivations, are we really suggesting that all physicians are interested in is money? They don't care about their patients' utility, their patients' health. And obviously, we might not be medically trained, but you can spot when you're being missold something. So if you go to a hospital with a bad back and they say you need a knee replacement, you're going to think, hang on, that's not right. So it's not unbounded what can happen, but it's not impossible for supplier-induced demand to happen. And finally today, so everything we've talked at has really been about the individual level. And when we talked about demand last week, we talked about this idea of aggregate demand. So a lot of the properties of demand curves don't hold at the individual level, but what happens at the aggregate level? And what do we think are the key determinants of health and demand for healthcare at a country level? So some hypotheses. Population age structures, countries with higher proportions of older people should demand more care. Sicker countries, so countries with higher levels of sickness and disease, should have higher levels of demand. Unhealthy countries with higher prevalences of unhealthy stuff like smoke and alcohol, etc., should have higher increases, higher aggregate demand for health. But essentially, in all the empirical studies where you look at cross-country analysis, it's essentially income or GDP. Richer countries spend more money on healthcare. And essentially 94% of the variation in the relationship between healthcare expenditure is explained by variations in income. So essentially GDP per person is by far and away the single most important thing in determining aggregate demand for healthcare. So this is just a figure from the Morris book. So this is in levels. So it's GDP per capita in US dollars versus healthcare expenditure. You can see you've got this almost perfectly linear relationship here. And if you log it, it becomes even more sort of linear. So perfectly log linear. Almost every point it was in that 95% confidence interval. And at the aggregate level, as I said last week, you get this really controversial result that the income elasticity of demand is bigger than 1. So in a very early study it was 1.31. Income elasticity of demand bigger than 1 indicates a luxury good. So this aggregate demand analysis suggests that healthcare is a luxury good. Now that's controversial because we know that shouldn't be the case, but empirically that is what comes out. The Newhouse basically countered this by saying countries that spend more may well be more caring, but there's a little evidence of a Q-run effect. And again, one of the charts in the ONS that I showed in week 1, if you could compare spending on healthcare with levels of health, you get a really weird relationship. And the US is a very weird anomaly. So the US spends by far and away the most on healthcare per capita, but it's got some of the lowest levels of health. So you don't get relationships. So just because countries are spending a lot on healthcare doesn't mean it comes out in terms of health. But again, there's lots of inequalities in the US. So rich people in the US spend a lot on health and have brilliant health. Many people in the US spend little on health because they can't, and they have some of the worst health outcomes in the Western world. So again, we've got aggregate level problems. But this tends to suggest that healthcare is a luxury good. But essentially, estimating and aggregating demand and looking at relationships is quite fraught with econometric concerns. So economists, as typical with economists, spend a lot of time arguing with each other about what is the right way to look at this relationship. So do we really believe that healthcare is a luxury good? Do we really believe income is the only factor that influences the demand for health at an aggregate level? Is this based on economic theory? Why is income the major thing? What is it about income that is theoretically associated with the demand for healthcare? Or is this just an econometric, a statistical phenomenon that's just coming out of the data? So people tend to question how you meaningfully compare between countries. So when you look at the total expenditure on per capita, if you look at total GDP, you can use purchasing power parity to look at sort of equivalising across countries, but no equivalent exists for healthcare. There is no universal conversion between spending on healthcare. And if you use PPP, it's not perfect. In fact, it's probably the opposite of perfect. It masks a lot of the variation that we're really interested in. On this economic theory, what other things should we account for? How do we go about measuring these? Again, it gets quite controversial. And on the econometric specification, if you use macroeconometric methods, you actually get very different results than if you use microeconometric methods. So you should theoretically use macro methods because this is macro data. It's between country. But because you have lots of countries, macro models do very badly when you've got big N, small t, which is exactly what we've got. So you should probably use micro models, which what we did. If you did the same thing time series, then you get a very different result. And again, this is an association. A lot of people rightly point out this isn't causal. This could be entirely reverse causal, in fact. So it's not a causal relationship. We're not saying income causes increases in healthcare expenditure. We're just saying the two things seem to move together. So in terms of topic 2, we've gone through some basic theory, tweaked it to account for health. And the key thing is this idea of the Grossman model. And again, don't read too much about the algebra, focus on the graphical representation, and spend some time looking at some of those papers and looking for other papers on how education affects health. And try to think what you think about that relationship. Does education affect health? Why does education affect health? How can we prove or disprove education affects health? And always bear in mind we have these problems with asymmetry and how we go about disentangling some of these relationships. So the Morris book chapter 2 is really, really useful in this space, and there are some papers on theory which are quite light touch and some specific empirical examples should you wish to look at more detail. I think these are all available through links in Blackboard. And again, please do try and look at the tutorial questions before next week. Don't worry about creating answers, but do have a look about what questions you'd like us to go through. Have a nice weekend. And if anyone wants the thingy, I'll put it back up once more. Yeah, you too.
I'm not sure, but it's okay. I'm not too Yes. Yeah, I'm not really too sure. Like they send emails every now. Like last semester, I think they didn't, so I didn't use it at all. Then I started getting some angry emails about like that.
I know you're here, so it's fine. Yeah. No problem. I did it.
Yeah.
I did it on the train.
Yeah, I think it's all good. Even if I didn't go through it all.
Yeah. See you later. Bye.
Also, sir, I'm not going to be able to make next week's tutorial. So, is there any way I can like get access to the information that's going to be on it?
Yeah, it's all the sketch solutions online, and I might actually make. In the pandemic, we did it all online.
Yeah.
So I recorded some videos. I think I made them available.
Yes.
Wacky hair, different times.
Yeah.
Content stuff.
Yeah. You know, if you could, that'd be amazing. Just because I'm going to miss it and they're not recorded. But
Yeah. And the sketch solutions are good enough to go through. But I'll put the videos that we did from 2020, which you'll need to look at them.
Yeah. Also, just a reminder: the format of the exam is essay style, right?
Section A
online.
Section A would be.
Yeah.
Section B can be a little bit more sort of short questions. So there might be a few sort of numerical things, but very high level addition, multiplication, algebra.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Brilliant. Thank you, sir.
Totally.
I wanted to ask when's the release date for the midterm?
It is week 7. So it handed week 10. I think we get 3 weeks to do it.
Okay.
Week 7.
Okay.
But it's on the stuff from Ego's house.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So it's not the stuff that we're doing now?
No.
Okay.
But this stuff is useful for the exam.
And so we have 3 weeks to do what? It's write an essay, right?
Yeah, 700 quid word.
Nice.
Okay.
It won't take 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You should definitely not spend 3 weeks,
Yeah.
but you've got that.
That's how
Yes,
then.
okay.
Thank you.
We used to give you longer, but people got worried that you have to do more than you have to do. So we give 3 weeks.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. But yeah, it's
Okay.
when
Okay.
it comes online, we'll let you know.
Okay.
Have a lovely weekend.
Yeah, you
Bye.
too.
人吗？不能那么早就下课吧？我看黑板上有显示一个扣子，没有。有，但是擦掉了看不清。请问你有话说的，我记得他有话说的是你还有就是你会联赛，他跟你说什么？老师都是这样的。